At my son's wedding, my husband thought the drama would belong to him. He'd rehearsed it, the timing, the crowd, the angle that would make him the star of his own exit. He stood up from the head table with a glass, still half full of champagne, cleared his throat, and prepared to tell the room he was leaving our marriage. The band faltered. Conversations folded in on themselves. For a few heartbeats, the air tasted like silverware and disbelief. I did not rise to meet him. I reached for a cream envelope from beside my plate, slid it quietly within his view, and folded an even smaller smile into the shape of my face. "This day is for our son," I said, voice steady. "Read it later." I left my napkin where it was, left my fork where it had fallen, and walked out of the marquee as if I were stepping into the garden simply for air. There is a distinct clarity that comes when you have worked with numbers all your life. They do not perform for the room. They do not need an audience. They wait. When you know how to listen to accounts and ledgers, the rest of life becomes a series of signals. Gregory's theatrics were noise. The quiet instrument of consequence was the envelope. Outside, the late summer evening smelled of cut grass and lemon-scented candles. I could hear his voice behind me, a flurry of panic that started with indignation and devolved into the kind of frantic sentences men use when they want to manufacture bewilderment. "Bianca, what are you doing?" "You can't." He tried to make it a spectacle. He wanted eyes on him and the reassurance that he still commanded the stage. I did not look back. In my pocket my phone buzzed. Julian, our son. A single word, Mum. He was already moving toward the marquee, flanked by his new wife and a cluster of guests who had seen the emptying of a table like a tide. There were eyes that flicked to me as if I might suddenly collapse. There were others that held judgment. There were even a couple who smiled as if at a private joke they were not party to. I steadied myself against the low stone wall, put one hand on it, and let the chill seep into my palm. My throat was completely calm. If you want every step of how I turned that night into the beginning of something else, stay with me. It is trivial, perhaps, but weddings have a rhythm that helps memory. The singer's voice lowered. The pianist hit a minor chord when Gregory spoke. There was a tray of canapes 5 yards away that no one touched. My son stood at the head table looking at his father, a man he had idolized since boyhood, trying to reconcile the toast he had expected with the man making it. That imaged Julian's face. The slight tremor in his jaw has played back for me in the weeks since. And it is gentler than the one I store in my pocket, a folder of bank statements, messages, and a prenup clause I had once signed, thinking it was protection for both of us. Behind the envelope, mentioned only by me to a few people that night, was not a letter of spite. It held documents, screenshots, a terse note addressed to Gregory listing what I had done. I wrote one line at the top, for when you have the courage to read without an audience. Underneath, I had attached a printout of a transfer that did not belong to us, the first breadcrumb. You might think the leak of a life is sudden. It is not. Infidelity is sometimes a burst of light. But more often it is incremental. A habit grows. Small payments appear beside legitimate entries on a bank feed. And only someone who reads transactions for a living the patterns, the round numbers, the standard descriptors that friends and lovers think opaque can see the route being paved. I noticed the first transfer across months. A payment of £500. Then again. It cleared at odd hours. The beneficiary was an apparently innocuous, limited company name that, if you dug a little deeper, mapped back to a person. When Gregory pretended to leave the room that night, he had thought his performance would close a chapter. He underestimated the extent, to which numbers can outlive improvisation. The investigation took time, and that time is important to the story. I did not act for spite. I planned. I am a financial professional. It has been my life. And when you have advised families about safeguarding their assets, you learn a temperament. Calm, observant, patient. It is the opposite of a Twitter fury. I matched Gregory's volatility with method. It started with the bank app. A tiny notification, transfer to CW Limited. Most people skip past that. I copied it, screenshot by screenshot, and then trolled through the account to build context. Patterns reveal themselves when you look for them. Date repeats, similar descriptors, the same merchant codes disguised by the company name. I followed a trail that led from coffee shops, billed as client meetings, to hotel stays, to a small rental firm that supplied short-term storage lockers. The locker rented month after month had, oddly, no address attached to the company name. Where there is a blank, there is a question. You do not need to be a detective to be curious. You need to be prepared to be patient. I began to keep a journal of times and dates, written in the margins of invoices. I created spreadsheets that turned what would otherwise be an annoyingly chaotic list into a map. When patterns cluster, you get a map. When you get a map, you can begin to predict next steps. Messages followed. There is a rhythm to the way people talk when they are planning a new life. Excited, logistical, irresponsibly romantic. There were texts on Gregory's phone that matched bookings on the accounts. There were names that appeared Cassandra Wells appearing in calendars, in short emails, in photographs sent at odd hours. I am not naive. People make mistakes. But the accumulation creates a picture. The prenup was the twist I did not expect at the start of our marriage, and the lever I did not anticipate using. Years when we sensible. Gregory always liked certainty. We had been married for 28 years. The world had changed a great deal in that time. We had taken reasonable steps to divide responsibilities, to protect certain assets for Julian. There was a clause in it, coiffed in the language of legal precision, a fidelity-triggered adjustment to the distribution. At the time I read it aloud, and we both nodded in the solicitor's office, thinking it was common sense to discourage reckless remarriage around significant life events. Who thinks their partner will weaponize a document years later? When I found the clause tucked between paragraphs about pension sharing and spousal maintenance, it struck me like an irony, so cold it could have been carved. The very thing Gregory had been so keen to include had language that, if the court saw the behavior I'd collected, could operate as a decisive contractual mechanism. I will not pretend that contractual clauses are automatic moneymakers. They require interpretation and court approval. I had a solicitor, Philip, and I made sure to involve him early. With his guidance, we discussed possibilities, risks, and the fact that the wording would be tested in a forum that likes clarity more than drama. There is a strange intimacy in planning the downfall of a lie. You will want to know how I gathered the recordings people sometimes ask about. I am careful with the law. I did not break it, nor would I advise anyone to. In the jurisdiction where I live, one-party consent can make a recording admissible. I speak of this only to explain why a voice file I had turns up later in the timeline. I did not set out to entrap, to punch holes, or to engineer a trap. I kept notes, I saved messages, I backed up voicemails. And when a conversation occurred that was plainly about plans to leave, I recorded for my own recollection, something many of us do in domestic crises. That recording, and the ledger of transfers, became the backbone of the narrative we later presented. Philip is not showy. He is the kind of solicitor who wears sensible shoes and has the look of someone who has handled larger egos than ours. He sat with me in his office the Tuesday morning after I decided to take steps. There was a rain-smeared window, a tray of half-too-strong coffee, and between us a manila envelope that smelled faintly of printer ink. "We don't litigate emotion," he said, which was his way of saying the law speaks in proof. "We litigate facts." I liked that. Facts are a refuge we prepared carefully. Philip drafted letters to the bank to flag suspicious transactions. He wrote to custodians holding joint investments and asked for temporary holds pending clarification. I include these details only to show that a legal process was initiated. Outcomes depend on the court and the particular facts of a case. Our strategy was not, and never should be, a public spectacle. It was a necessary step to preserve what could be taken advantage of in a matter of weeks, if Gregory chose to accelerate a plan he had been hatching. There is another truth here that is softer. The mathematics of betrayal do not erase what we shared. There are pictures on the mantelpiece. A family clock that has wound itself down several times, and which we always forgive and wind again. Those things matter. Julian's needs mattered more than any desire. I might have had to make a theatrical scene. My priority was to protect him, and to make sure that any reckoning was done in a manner that didn't leave our son carrying the shards of our failure alone. Confrontation came not in the marquee with its white drapes and fairy lights, but at home, in the room where we had shared quieter mornings. It was later that evening. Gregory arrived with the residue of his earlier performance still on him, frantic energy. A voice perpetually on a high note, hands that moved in circles, as if he could gesticulate himself into innocence. We had the mantelpiece between us, the photographs of Julian at 8 and at 28, still smiling. There was a clock, the same one that had kept bad time during our rough patches. He slammed the front door. He wanted an argument. I offered him a glass of water. He accused me of public humiliation. He called me vindictive. He said, with the insolence of guilt, that our son deserved grandparents and not divorce. He tried to make the moral center of the moment be me. Listened. Then I placed on the coffee table a tablet from which a voice file played. It was not theatrical. It was a conversation I had preserved where plans were discussed. I let it run through to the point where Gregory, in his own voice, used a phrase about moving out right after the vows and then laughed at the notion that the wedding itself would be the perfect pivot. The room felt suddenly sterile. Even he, listening to himself, could hear how close to premeditation some things sounded. He raged. He asked how I had the file. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I told him, plainly, that I had been lining up facts. I told him that I had secured, with Philip's assistance, letters to banks and custodians. I did not boast. I laid out the steps, as one might detail an itinerary. I did not shout. He found that infuriating. Our son came home after the reception. He had missed part of his own speeches. He had seen only fragments of his father's absences and assumed, like so many of us, who want to believe in the myth of our parents, that there would be an explanation. When he walked into that living room and saw the scene of our confrontation, his face folded into an expression that will remain with me. Not the wide-eyed horror of a child, but the precise, adult hurt of someone realizing a long-held image of his father needed redecorating. Julian asked questions with a restrained intensity. "Is it true?" he said. The question was not accusatory. It was a request for a set of facts that could be handled, not an invitation for drama. I answered the best I could. I told him what I knew and what I did not. He was furious, yes, but his anger hit the place it should, at deception, not at me. He wanted to know if we, his parents, had been honest with him. In that moment I felt, for all my crimes in this story, useful. He needed a shelter of clarity, and we had to supply it. Cassandra appeared at our door the next day, not with knives and banners but with the kind of shaky, apologetic composure of someone who had discovered that the man she had aligned herself with was less than he had promised. She had the look of somebody on the edge of an identity crisis, younger. Probably late 30s, hair a little too sleek for the circumstances and shoes that clicked too loudly. Her eyes kept flicking to the mantelpiece, as if to find some narrative there that might include her. She did not expect the ledger, the recordings, the letters. She had expected something cleaner, perhaps a clear break, with fewer consequences. And when the crooked edges of Gregory's finances showed up in her inbox, small overdrafts, a reliance on joint investments he'd never mentioned, she began to fray. None of this is to revel in anyone's discomfort. Cassandra is a person, so is Gregory. People have their reasons. But equally, people must be responsible for the architecture of their lives. The difference between us in the weeks that followed was that I had planned. He had panicked. She had believed him in the absence of evidence. We all do that sometimes because the alternative is to accept a dismantling of who we thought someone was. We took legal steps. I cannot overemphasize that this is where the story becomes formal rather than moral theater. With Philip's guidance, we applied for a freeze on certain joint accounts, pending disclosure. The bank required evidence, the ledger, the messages, the recording, and Philip provided a compact bundle that was both clinical and unsparing. The bank's legal team read it with an attention that was almost reverential. There is an odd satisfaction in presenting a file so complete that it leaves little room for poetic defenses. But satisfaction was not my goal. Preservation was. When a solicitor tells you they can move to secure assets, they do not make promises. They issue judgments based on precedents and appetite. I will not pretend the outcome was preordained. The application could have been denied. The court could have found the clause ambiguous. Instead, the bank put a temporary hold on several transfers, and the custodians agreed to delay any moves. I remember the relief like a quiet heat in my chest, not triumph. But the kind of relief you get when a thing you have been diligent about refuses to unravel overnight. The next week blurred into hearings, adjournments, and the kind of paperwork that chews at your patience. We had to prepare witness statements, to file exhibits, to make the case that the prenup clause was relevant because of documented conduct and because there was an imminent risk of dissipation. Each morning I would sit with a cup of tea and reread the timelines to make sure nothing had gone missing. I would call Philip, and he would answer with the calm of someone who keeps litigation as if it were a chessboard. "We are consolidating," he'd say. "We need to be tidy." Our social circle began to rearrange itself. People are not neutral in the face of moral ambiguity. They pick sides, sometimes based on principle, often based on fear. Some friends, who had known Gregory longer than they knew me, were stunned into silence. Others, who had seen the small things noticed by no one, came forward with stories that knitted into the same fabric. Diana, my sister, chose the quiet but sure path of support. She brought casseroles. She took Julian for long walks. She said the kinds of things sisters are permitted to say, practicalities. Hot meals, the reminders that you do not have to move through a crisis alone. We had, at this stage, crossed a line. The envelope at the wedding had been the ignition. What followed was the slow gear, change of bureaucracy. There were days when Gregory called at odd hours, when his voice moved between apology and indignation as the mood suited him. There were nights when Julian sat on the kitchen floor and cried into his hands, or when he walked past a photograph and shook his head at the shape of his childhood. I tried to make room for all of it without letting it center me. Weeks later, there was a flurry of communication from Gregory's new counsel. He accused us of orchestrating a premeditated campaign. Accused me whispering to acquaintances of theatrics and cruelty. Such things happen. Anger seeks a target. But when the court papers arrived scheduling an urgent hearing to consider the freeze, a terse letter with a date and a courtroom number, Gregory's tone changed from bluster to panic. Suddenly there was an urgency in his steps that had not been there when he rehearsed his departure speech. We arrived on a wet morning. It felt appropriate. The rain was a grey curtain that made the city's edges blur. The law has its theatre, too. A long room, an elevated bench, a man with a small voice who asks you to speak to the point. I walked into that building with a folder under my arm that contained the work of months, redacted bank statements, timestamps, copies of the recording, and a letter I had written to my son explaining why I had not chosen humiliation in public, but had instead insisted on a process. There was a certain intimacy to the way the files sat between us and the court. It felt like laying out bones for someone to read. I will not tell you what the judge said that day, not yet. The resolution is not the point. This section of the story is the pivot, the moment where planning intersects with consequence, and where a private life begins. To be passed by public mechanisms, the hearing was brisk. The legal mechanics felt both prosaic and decisive. The judge asked direct questions. The opposing counsel parried, and my solicitor stood like a rock, handing exhibits as if they were small, uncontentious things. Out in the corridor, Julian reached for my hand. He did not want a speech. He wanted to feel that a parent was present. I squeezed his fingers, and for a second the world narrowed to that contact. Me. Him. Our small, imperfect immunity against the rest of it. People tend to forget that legal disputes are not simply about money. They are about dignity and the ability to claim an ordinary life in the teeth of unpredictability. When we left the court that day, nobody cheered. There was no grand resolution. There was simply a series of practical instructions and an interim order that meant, for the time being, certain transfers could not be made, and that the heart of Gregory's plan, whatever form it truly took, could not proceed unchecked. The envelope at the wedding had become a legal instrument because of the labor that followed, the documentation, the solicitor's work, the reluctant arithmetic of reality. I often get asked, without malice, whether I felt vindicated. Vindication is a poor word for the outcome. Vindication suggests a triumph of ego. What I felt was something quieter, a reconfiguration of my options. I had spent decades as part of a partnership. Now, in the small hours and in the flashes between hearings, I began to imagine a life in which fiscal security and emotional clarity were not mutually exclusive. That is not the same as joy. It is a clarity that makes new things possible. There are moments that, at the time, seem too small to matter and later stretch themselves taut across the narrative like threads. One such moment occurred a month into the proceedings. Cassandra sent me a brief message. I'm sorry. It was not much. She offered tea at a neutral cafe and the conversation was, for both of us, awkward. She had been on the verge of moving into an apartment, funded by funds she believed were available to Gregory. Seeing the paper trail unsettled her. She asked practical questions. How do you move on? How do you protect yourself? Questions that I could answer in a professional capacity without telling her the moral calculus of our family. I told her, simply, that people often conflate advice with blame. You weren't alone, I said. You were a person in someone's story. She cried once, a single clean sound, and then left to collect herself. I do not celebrate her distress. Allowed it. In the weeks that followed, friends rearranged their loyalties. Some distance grew, and an intimacy developed with those who remained. My sister, certain friends who had known me before wedding cake, and my son, who had to become the curator of his own grief. On a clear, sharp morning I sat down at my desk for the first time in months and began to think beyond proceedings. I pulled up a document and started drafting a plan for a consultancy, not for vengeance, but for assistance. I had spent 30 years in finance, advising on safeguarding assets and simplifying complex portfolios for people whose lives were, at times, tumultuous. There was a humility to the idea and an appetite. I wrote a brief mission statement to help women navigate financial transitions with dignity and clarity. The phrase felt honest and useful. I made a list of services, of the small things I could teach: reading a bank feed, setting up protections, understanding what a prenup might mean. I wrote it as if it were a letter to myself, which in a way it was. That first week of planning was stolen between phone calls with the solicitor, meetings with advisors, and the routine of providing shelter and truth to my son. There were moments of levity, too. Diana insisted on bringing us fresh scones, and we sat in the garden and argued over jam with the petty ferocity of siblings who had never been inclined to quit on one another. There is healing in the ordinary. There is dignity in making tea for someone who is in pain. The story does not end here. The hearing was only the beginning of the formal process. There were still court dates to be scheduled, negotiations to be had, and the delicate task of explaining to others why I had chosen a path of measured resistance instead of a public collapse. For now, however, as the rain dried and the leaves on the London plane tree outside our window shook off the last of the season, I found myself in a new position, not a woman trapped in the architecture of someone else's life, but someone reconsidering the shape of her own. That evening, as I closed my laptop and gathered the files into their neat folder, I felt the strange double sensation of loss and potential. The envelope under Gregory's plate had done its quiet work. The law had begun to act. My son was safe from the immediate combustions that might have followed if we had not intervened. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in months, allowed myself to think in 4-year plans, not merely in damage limitation. When the phone rang, it was Philip with a voice that carried the mild, controlled excitement of someone about to make a tactical move. "We have a date," he said. "An urgent hearing has been set. There's a chance to seek interim orders." I could hear the rhythmic clack of his pen as he reviewed his notes. My stomach tightened in a way that was not panic. It was readiness. I folded up the day's papers and put them carefully into the manila envelope that had once been full of invention and now contained a different kind of purpose. I thought, briefly, of the Marquis of the Soft Light. The clink of cutlery, the momentary hush when a man who had wanted spectacle realized he had been outplayed by an index of truths. I did not gloat. There was no pleasure in the bruising of another's attempts at theatre. There was, however, a firm satisfaction in having responded with composure rather than fury. Julian knocked before he came in that night. We had no script for what the next years would look like, but there was an agreement between us: candor, prioritizing his stability and an openness to whatever next steps came with legal prudence. "Whatever happens in that court," he said quietly, "we'll do it together." He sounded small and very grown-up at the same time. That is where this part of the story pauses, on the lean edge between the preliminary legal machinery and the larger adjudication that would follow. The envelope had been placed. The files had been compiled, and the hearing had been scheduled. The next chapter would require patience, legal argument, and, for me, the slow work of rebuilding a professional life that could help others avoid the kind of brittle shock we had felt. There are things I have not told you yet, details that belong to a later hour, the precise manner in which certain transfers were made, the way particular friends responded when evidence was shown to them, the conversations that led Cassandra to decide where she stood. There will be time for the mechanics and, later, the outcomes. For now, I will finish with what I said to myself as I put out the lights that night. I had not planned to become a cautionary tale or a public lesson. I had planned to be a mother and a partner, when neither role could contain the truth. I chose a course that preserved our son and preserved the dignity that makes reinvention possible. If you are still with me, thank you. There is more to come, the hearing, the social consequences, and the beginning of a consultancy that was born not out of bitterness, but out of the need for practical, honest help. I will tell you how the judge listened, what the interim orders meant in practice, and how, slowly, the scaffolding of a new life began to take shape. But that comes next. We left the court with a paper that felt at once banal and sturdy, an interim order. The kind of thing that lives in the world of lawyers and clerks, but has the accidental power to alter daily life. It said, in sober language, that certain transfers were to be frozen, that custodians were to delay disbursements, and that parties were to provide disclosure. It did not feel like drama. It felt like an instruction we could build on. In the days that followed, the practicalities arrived like small, necessary storms. The bank's compliance team rang to confirm receipt of paperwork. An administrator at one of the investment houses asked for a notarized list of accounts. Philip sent short emails with subject lines that carried no melodrama. Requesting documents and provisional timeline, I learned to value the dullness of procedure. Steadying. It kept me from doing what the world still expected of a woman in my position, sobbing into the night and making grand declarations to anyone with a sympathetic ear. Gregory didn't know how to be procedural. He knew how to perform. In place of the stage, he had to learn how to navigate a sequence of emails and legal deadlines. At first, he flitted between fury and supplication. There were frantic calls to friends, an attempt at an eloquent apology to Julian, a tearful voicemail to Diana that she did not answer. He spent money on lunches with acquaintances, attempting to marshal social currency into something resembling credibility. It is pathetic to watch, even more so when you recognize the underlying shame. He was not simply upset that his scheme had been halted. He was ashamed of being visible in his smallness. Cassandra, meanwhile, made a choice. She could have tried to cling to whatever promise Gregory had given her. Instead, once she saw the ledgers and the recordings, she chose to step back. She moved out of the flat she had been considering and returned to a job she had put on hold. We met once, in a neutral cafe, and the conversation was clumsy and candid. She wanted to know how to protect herself, and whether the mess she thought she was inheriting could be separated from the man who had created it. I answered with the tools of my trade how to read a bank statement, how to seek independent advice, and not with the fury of someone scolding a conspirator. She cried once, and then apologized. And then we parted with the awkward mutual recognition of people who had been thrown into someone else's drama. Julian watched more than he spoke. He was not inclined to theatrical gestures. He called me in the middle of the night and asked for facts. He wanted to know whether the house was safe, whether grandparents would be affected, whether the funds we had hoped would support his planned home renovations were at risk. When he spoke of his father, his voice was compacted grief. "I trusted him, Mum," he said, simply. "I want to understand what that means now." We spent hours talking, not only about what had happened but about what he wanted from his life. He needed reassurance that he could still plan, that the wedding could be a memory of a day in which he had said a true thing about the woman he loved, and not a doorstep for the collapse of his parents. It surprised me how much of the healing was practical, budget, recalculated. Conversations with his wife about her expectations, a decision about whether to sell an inherited bicycle he had never liked. In the smallness of these tasks, there was mending. In the ordinariness of laundry and joint tax forms, there was the slow reweaving of our family. There were difficult days. Friends rearranged themselves in ways that felt like require a new map. Some older acquaintances, those loyal to Gregory over decades, took time to process the evidence. Others, who had quietly noticed things for years but never voiced them, edged closer. Diana was a constant. She sat in our kitchen with a tray of soup and an expression that admitted neither theater nor sermon. She listened when I needed to talk and gave space when I needed silence. It is astonishing, the value of someone who knows how to stay. The months passed in a rhythm of filings, disclosure requests, and provisional hearings. In that liminal time, I started to take my plan seriously. The consultancy I had sketched in stolen moments turned into a proper proposition. I rented a small studio near the river, a modest space with tall windows, a second-hand desk, and a potted fern that had a tendency to lean toward the light. I called it Caldwell Advisory, because vanity must sometimes be practical. My first website was spare, a photograph of a neat, well-lit desk, a brief mission statement, and a list of services that emphasized clarity, dignity, and practical help for people navigating financial transitions. The first client was someone I had known at church for years, a woman named Elaine, whose husband had died without leaving clear accounts. She came to me with a shoebox of loose papers and an exhausted expression. We spent an afternoon sorting out pension forms and an unfamiliar trust deed. It was not glamorous. It was work that mattered. When she left with a clearer sense of what belonged to whom, she hugged me and said, very quietly, "You could do this for others." That hug felt like permission. I began to take clients in the evenings, while Philip and I waited for courtroom dates. I taught women to read their bank feeds, to understand joint account protocols, and, most importantly, to think in timelines. My experience in the legal project helped. I could explain why contemporaneous notes matter, why taking a deliberate, methodical approach is the antithesis of the chaos that follows betrayal. I never presented myself as a solicitor. I always recommended proper legal advice when it was needed. What I offered was clarity, ways of making complicated financial lives legible. A local magazine ran a short piece about my work. It was the kind of exposure that leads to a handful of calls and a spike of website visits. I did a radio interview 10 minutes about the basics of securing finances, and afterwards an email trail of women arrived, each with her own story. I found I liked the rhythm of helping someone take back a small piece of their autonomy. I liked that the work was practical, that people left sessions with folders and action lists. It felt less like revenge than repair. Throughout, the legal process continued. There were delays, as courts often have, and moments of irritation when opposing counsel tried to press technicalities. Philip remained a calm presence, his emails an economy of phrase that I had come to appreciate. We prepared for the final hearing with the same quiet thoroughness with which we had prepared the interim application, a bundle of documents, witness statements, timelines, and the voice file I had recorded. I had no appetite for theater in the courtroom. I wanted clarity, and for the judge to see the pattern as plainly as I had seen it. On the morning of the final hearing, the city was clear, and the courtroom full of the small noises that precede legal business, the turning of pages, the soft cough, the scrabble of paper. Gregory was present, looking thinner in a way that suit cloth does not disguise. He had counsel that tried, with varying degrees of success, to argue ambiguity. Their case leaned on phrases and possibilities. Ours leaned on corroborated actions. The judge listened with an economy of attention. I will not pretend the confirmation was theatrical. It was procedural. The judge found, upon consideration of the evidence, that the prenup clause I had relied upon could be given weight in the circumstances we presented. He emphasized that contractual clauses are delicate things and that outcomes depend on the precise wording and surrounding facts. The ruling was narrowly framed, a decision that the clause could be enforced to the extent necessary to protect assets under the particular facts we had brought. In plain terms, the court endorsed the approach Philip had taken and protected the core of what I had sought to preserve. When the decision was read, there was no applause. There was, instead, an odd stillness, the kind that follows a practical outcome. For some, that would be triumph. For me, it was relief, a legal affirmation that the route I had chosen, quiet documentation, measured action, had been sufficient to stop a dissipative plan and allow for an orderly disentanglement. The pedigree of the prenup, something once created as a safety net, became, ironically, the instrument that prevented an immediate scramble to deplete assets. That irony did not make me gleeful. It made me reflective about the odd ways contracts, like people, can be repurposed. After the ruling, the practical work continued. We negotiated settlements for certain joint investments. There were transfers that had to be unwound and arrangements to buy Gregory out of shared properties. He resisted in ways that were mostly performative, stipulated emails, theatrical offers that never materially improved his position. Over time, the scaffolding of his plan eroded. He moved into a small flat on the other side of town. He called less. Once, he left a long, sorrowful voicemail asking for reconciliation. I returned his call with a measured message that acknowledged the past and set a boundary for the future. There was no dramatic scene. Mostly, there was the ordinary business of two adults, reconfiguring the lives they'd shared. The social consequences had a slower timetable. Some friendships endured, others fell away. It is unsettling to watch who chooses what. There were dinners that were never extended again, invitations that stopped arriving, and the small severings of a life once shared. Yet there were compensations, new colleagues, a few professional contacts who admired what I had done and offered introductions, and clients who trusted someone who had been in the trenches and come out able to teach what she had learned. Cassandra occasionally sent notes, updates on a flat, a new job, a question about a bank account she had come to understand better. We were not friends in the way the past might have allowed, but we had a civility that felt earned. Once, She came to a talk I gave at a local community center about financial transitions. She sat at the back, hair pulled into a low ponytail, and afterwards stayed to ask one question about pensions. "When, she lovely? Thank you." It was enough, Julian, and I found a new rhythm. He grew into a role that is painful and grown-up, the son who must make sense of two parents. He and his wife moved into a modest terrace with a small garden and began the project of making a home. He would text me pictures of paint, swatches, and ask about insurance policies. He came to some client sessions with me, not to intrude but to see how I worked. He told friends about the consultancy as a way of explaining our family change, as a sign that he thought my new work mattered. As my business grew, I stayed conscious of the moral contour of my choices. The envelope at the wedding had been the catalyst. Yes, but it was the subsequent restraint, legal process and care that produced a defensible outcome. I never promoted drama as a tactic. I emphasized process. When women came to me, shaken and angry, I taught them to prioritize safety and clarity. I did not advise entrapment or clandestine measures. I suggested the quiet power of paperwork and the dignity of legal counsel. People who have been through betrayal need maps and companions, not sermons. There were quieter, softer victories. One of my earliest clients, Elaine, sent me a photo of herself, holding a check, a settlement for an unresolved estate item. She had paid off a small debt and was starting to travel again. A woman named Maureen, who had taken one of my workshops, wrote to say she felt less frightened of reading her accounts. These small progresses mattered more to me than any score against Gregory. They constituted the real currency of the work I had chosen. There were, of course, moments of private doubt. Some nights I lay awake and imagined different pasts, or wondered whether I had handled things as kindly as I might have. Anger is a complicated companion. It can fuel action, but also leave you with the exhausted feeling of someone who has run a marathon in shoes to sizes too small. I sought therapy for a while, not because I was broken, but because I wanted a neutral place to process the strange hybridity of grief and possibility. Talking with someone helped me separate my identity from the role of the betrayed. It gave me space to imagine a life that was not defined by Gregory's choices. Years, in their gentle manner, smoothed the edges. Caldwell Advisory grew into a modest practice with two part-time colleagues and a roster of clients who appreciated careful, empathetic help. I delivered workshops at local community centers, wrote a short guide on reading household accounts, and spoke at a women's network about the intersection of finance and dignity. The work kept me busy in the pleasant way that comes when you enjoy what you do. Gregory, for his part, faded into a quieter life. He remarried, years later, to someone who might have known his history or perhaps not. I do not know, nor do I wish. We exchanged, at one point, a single civil email about the disposal of some shared memorabilia. I replied with a sentence that was practical and brief. It felt appropriate. On the last day, the litigation formally closed. An administrative note, the kinds of stamps lawyers love to produce. Julian and I stood in the garden and drank something cold. The plane tree outside our window had been trimmed. It threw light in a softer way. He laughed about some small domestic catastrophe involving a wonky washing machine and a neighbor's cat. The air felt ordinary, which was the point, not miraculous. Not entirely healed, but capable of ordinary things again. I keep the envelope from that wedding in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It is a plain cream envelope, slightly scuffed at the corners. It has no sentimental value in the usual sense. It is simply a marker the moment I chose a course that prioritized my son's welfare, my own dignity, and a methodical insistence on truth over spectacle. That choice allowed for a different kind of renewal, one built on the skills I already had, fashioned into a service for others. People sometimes ask if I feel whole. I do not think wholesomeness is the right word. I feel different, less defined by the role of someone else's wife, and more by the sum of the things I do. I teach, I advise, and I try not to be bitter. I have learned that dignity is not the absence of pain. It is the way you move through it. If there is a moral I would offer quietly, it is this: when your life is unsettled by someone else's choices, choose a path that preserves possibility. Use counsel, gather facts, and protect the vulnerable in your life, especially children, when they are involved. Seek help, yes, but also build something you can call your own. For me, that was Coldwell Advisory, a modest enterprise that turned expertise into shelter for others. I do not tell this to boast. I tell it because the story is practical and because I have met too many women who believed the only options were submission or spectacle. There is a third way: steady work, measured action, and, ultimately, reinvention that is more about service than revenge. If you have been through something similar, know that rebuilding is possible, and that small acts, a sorted folder, a careful conversation, a plan sketched on the back of a receipt, can change the shape of things. Julian and I still find moments when we look at old photographs and remark at the young faces we once recognized. We do not erase the past. We put it into a drawer of memory that can be opened when necessary, but is otherwise not required to direct every day. I have learned to enjoy the mornings again, to make tea without thinking of the next crisis, and to appreciate the slow accumulation of work that helps other people find their feet. If my story has value at all, it is not as a blueprint. Laws and circumstances differ, and no two lives are the same, but as an example that steadiness and clarity can yield practical protection and new purpose. The envelope placed itself on a table that evening. What followed was not a drama, but a long sequence of small, determined acts. If you'd like more stories like this, practical accounts of reinvention and concrete ways to understand your finances in times of change, follow me. I will share what I have learned about holding on to dignity and finding a path forward when the architecture of your life shifts.